What we're going to talk about is the addendum R, the addendum O, and the most common that we use is the addendum A. I think I am going to do, I was debating whether to use the addendum A first and then go to R and O, but I think I'll go to, as I have it, R and O first. So these addendums are for your benefit, so you don't have to be using your own words. They cover all the what ifs that can happen in a transaction. And as we all know, there are 1,000 what ifs that can pop up. So these addendums, through the help of attorneys, try to cover what some of the what ifs that can happen in a transaction, either in an occupancy, which is addendum O, or in a rental property transaction, which is addendum R. So I'm just going to quickly go over these, why they're important to you and why they're a big help to you if you're dealing with occupancy or rental. So this says, instead of using your own words in a contract, use the addendum. It adds information and terms to your contract in a concise and legal verbiage. An addendum contains solutions to all of the possible what-ifs that can happen between buyers and sellers. The two addendum are more commonly used in our market besides the GMAR addendum A and the addendum S regarding lead paint. So this is really not in slideshow presentation.
Yeah, it's coming up as a PDF. I don't know
Oh, okay.
which is fine. We can
Yeah.
do it.
I got you.
Okay.
Okay, next one. So talking first about the addendum O, occupancy for use if the buyer wants to occupy the property prior to closing, which is not common, but it does happen. Or if the seller wants to occupy the property after closing. So you use the addendum O for either one of those situations. I want to put up a little red flag for agreeing to occupancy prior, for the buyer prior to closing. All sorts of rat's nests come up with that. The buyer moves in before he owns it, finds some things he doesn't like. Arguments ensue, deal falls apart. So it's probably best to do occupancy, letting the seller stay there for a little while after closing. So in the first few lines of this, you identify the property. So you put the date of the offer and the address of the property. You can kind of slide down to this next slide. The terms of this addendum preceded by an open box are part of the addendum O. Now, this is important. We had people get confused with this, but it's only part of the addendum O if the box is marked. Otherwise, it should be left blank or marked with an NA so there's no confusion. So it gives the address, and it then gives the choice of whether this is the buyer occupying pre-closing or the buyer allowing the seller to occupy post-closing. And then the next line is the occupancy charge. Usually you can calculate what their mortgage is divided by 30, or their mortgage payment per month divided by 30, and you get the daily charge that they would be paying when they own it. That's one way to come up with the occupancy charge. That charge is usually paid at the day of closing and held by whatever you put in there, who's going to hold it. The payment is due at the beginning of the occupancy period. Any unearned portion of the occupancy charge is or is not refundable based on actual occupancy. If it's not stricken, it's refundable. And that happens a lot. You know, the seller wants to stay there after closing for a week and a half. He gets everything done. He's fine. His next place is ready and he wants to leave after a week. he gets refunded the days that he didn't stay there. Again, that all depends too on how long they're staying. If they're just staying through the weekend, or they're just staying an extra day in order to get all their stuff out, you may not want to do an occupancy charge if you trust them, or the next thing, a security deposit. But if you are negotiating a longer occupancy, like anything more than a week, and some occupancy periods can be very long, they can be months, then you do want to have an occupancy charge, and you do want to have a prepaid security deposit, which will be held by, and sometimes it's the trust company or whatever. So that you talk about that, what happens, it goes on to explain what happens, if there's any damage, if there's any reason why the owner of the property at that time, the new buyer, shall keep some of the security deposit or not. But all of that is explained in the lines that are 19 through 25. So if we continue with addendum O, the next part talks about who pays the utilities. Again, this is usually comes into play if it's a longer occupancy. If the buyer's going to pay, then if the buyer's going to pay, then it's prorated at closing. A lot of these can be prorated at closing. Who's in charge of the maintenance? The occupant will be responsible for all routine repairs. What happens if there are major repairs and maintenance? Then you put a cap on the costs, like anything over $1,000. And then who is responsible? Who gets the keys? How many copies of the keys? When can the new owner be admitted to the property? What happens to the property taxes? Shall they be prorated through the day before closing or the occupancy date? These are all choices that the addendum O gives you to negotiate with the other party that's going to occupy. So these lines that we're showing you now, 6 through, I forgot how far that goes. 6 through, no, it's not.
I feel like that must be the second half of
Yes,
the.
it is the number.
Yep.
These are the different ones I just talked about. So you can decide not to use them, and so you would leave it blank or put NA in that box. Or if you are going to discuss these can be charges or these can be responsibilities during the occupancy period, then you use these phrases. So that's why the addendum O is good. It's what if, things that could happen, what would happen if these things do happen, like if a major problem happens with the property, some kind of an accident or something fails. You know, can the owner come in and visit every once in a while during the occupancy period, and how much notice does he have? Who's in charge of taking care of it? All of these things are there for you to discuss or to leave out and not use it. So then the last little page of addendum O is the actual use of the premises. Who the occupant will hold the owner harmless for all liabilities, claims, and expenses. That's a general comment. Obviously, if things get more serious, attorneys will be brought in. But basically, the occupant will hold the owner harmless for all liabilities, claims, and expenses resulting from occupant's use, possession, and occupancy of the premises, as described in this addendum. That's just an agreement between the parties. And the last one, which is really important, it's come up in a couple of calls that I've gotten. The owner, the new buyer who's giving occupancy to the seller, that seller cannot be treated as a landlord, as a tenant, the new buyer who's giving occupancy cannot be considered as a landlord. This is not a landlord-tenant relationship. And that's come up quite a bit because people are trying to put responsibilities on either the landlord or the tenant. And then they have to be remembered that they are not a tenant and a landlord. So they can't put those rights of tenancy onto this occupant. Any questions about this? That's pretty much the addendum O. So we'll go on to, and no questions about addendum O. You're fine.
Love it.
Addendum R, yes, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, love it.
Good. Addendum R, this regarding rental properties. So if you're a listing agent with a property that is currently being rented or has the possibility of being rented, but generally if it's currently being rented. So if you are selling your duplex, this is where the addendum R can come into place to help the transaction between the new buyer and the current owner or the landlord. So if the property is being rented, make sure that the personal property is in good working order. It all has to be sort of examined and reported. The rent schedule is on here. The number and kind of leases. The indemnification assigned all rights, title, and interest in leases to the buyer, and the buyer shall assume all duties at the time of closing. That's pretty much important. What the rent is and what the security deposit is. So that's the first part of the addendum O or R. So if we scale down, you can see where these are filled in. So the first part, after you put in the address of the property, you make checks in the boxes if this personal property is in the unit, in the building, and on what level it's on. So make those checks, and it gives notice to the person buying it where everything is. The next thing that is page 12 is the rent schedule, and it talks about the unit number and the lease expirations currently in place, the rent amount, the amount of the security deposit, any delinquent rents there are, and any penal ties levied. So that's very important information for a new buyer of a currently rented duplex or multifamily. The leases, you want to know what kind of leases there are. Complete copies of the current leases, rental applications for all the tenants are attached or shall be furnished within so many days of acceptance. That's very important if you're listing this multifamily, that you make sure that the tenant has this information and you can collect it, have it organized to give over to the new buyer, possible buyer. They have to know what kind of leases they are, if they're year leases, 3-year leases, month to month, and if there are any delinquent rents. So the indemnification is that all at closing seller shall assign all right, title, and interest in the leases to buyer, and buyer shall assume all duties, liabilities, and obligations thereunder as landlord. Make sure that when you're working with a buyer as a buyer's agent, that you can explain what those sentences mean. A lot of people just kind of brush over this, but it is something that they need to understand. So the seller, buyer shall indemnify and hold seller harmless from any claim or loss first arising from the events occurring after closing. So on the next page of addendum R, this is where there'll be tenant records, any change in status. Eviction, what happens? Requested vacancies. Only mark with an X if it's relevant to your offer. So if you're writing an offer and you want a tenant out by a certain time, this is helpful for you. New vacancies only mark with an X if relevant to your offer, and then there's a section of additional provisions. So this is what it looks like in the addendum R. That the rent for the month of closing shall be prorated through the day prior to closing. Security deposits, what happens with those? Where are they? Who's holding them? Tenant records, seller and shall give the buyer a copy of tenant records at closing, talking about check-in reports, payment records, correspondence notices, anything that's important that the new buyer should know about the existing tenants. Eviction, oh no, change in status, make sure that they are going to be changing, if they are going to be out before closing. And then what happens with eviction? Who's responsible for the eviction? Is it the new buyer or is it the current seller? You have that option. And the following provisions are part of this addendum if only marked with an X. And that's how I explained it. And that is mark with an X, requested vacancies. So if you want the tenant out and don't want him to be there, then you give what the unit is and when he should be vacant at closing or on maybe 5 days prior to closing. If tenants do not timely vacate the premises, buyer or seller shall be responsible to take all steps necessary to remove the tenants, including the filing of an eviction action. And then the section that you can mark with an X or not under new vacancies. If one unit or more units which were occupied on the date of the offer are vacant on the day before closing, buyer shall have the option to give seller written notice and this offer shall become null and void. So that's if you're about ready to close and the tenant that you were expecting to stay there leaves, the buyer has the option to terminate the offer at that point. Again, that's one of the two special provisions that you can mark. And notice that this addendum O is an initialed addendum. Excuse me, addendum R is an initialed addendum. And it's just when a form is initialed, it's really just an acknowledgement of what you want to agree on. So obviously, these are valuable aids to composing an offer with occupancy terms or if the property is a rental property. All of the sections can be relevant to the agreement between buyer and seller or not. Only mark with an X on the sections that apply to your offer. In the addendum R, the sections are relevant to all rental properties. Make sure that in the sections that show a choice of buyer or seller that you strike one of those. So that's pretty much a quick rundown of addendum R. Basically, what Steph and I want to give you is knowledge that these addendums exist. There have been so many times when I'm talking to an agent that's usually a newer agent, but they missed that part of their training and didn't realize that there was an addendum R or there was an addendum O. It makes your life much easier in drafting an offer if you're using under these two situations. Any questions on either of these addendums? You're set. You can use it. Don't forget they're there. A lot of I'll say, well, you're writing this duplex. Do you have an addendum R in place? No, it's an addendum R. So we don't want you to go there. Now, the next part, I'm going to talk about the addendum A. And this might be hard because in the slideshow, it's set up to scroll. And I'm not sure here, but if you have an addendum A, most likely it should be part of your offer. A lot of agents I know say, oh, I don't use an addendum A for condos. There really isn't that much for condos in there. What the addendum A was drafted for and what it is used for is really, it's a buyer protection form. It's a compilation of many years of lawyers adding to this. When I started, this was not even a full page, and now it's 4 pages. Things keep getting added to it because they are, number one, to protect the buyer in this transaction and to understand what different options can be made in your offer. So if you're talking about important things like testing, if you're talking about important things like well and water and sanitary, you're talking about a lot of different things that may or may not be relevant to your offer. It still is good to fill out what is, even if it's one little part, and attach it to your offer and send it in with your offer.
Mm-hmm.
So as we go in, and I'm not sure you can read this because on the one I had, I could blow it up.
Are you able to see that okay?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Okay, so the first part, obviously, you put in the date of the offer, matching the date of the offer to purchase that you are sending in with the address on there. And then the first box talks about inclusion of optional provisions. And that's the same sort of instruction. If there's something if you want to include one of these provisions, you have to mark it, the box in front of it. If they are not marked, left blank or with an NA, then it's not part of this addendum A. So make sure you attach that. Sometimes what happens, and it causes confusion, it's not marked with a check mark, but the lines within the provision are filled in. And so they're saying, well, what was the intent? Did they mean for this to be part of the offer and they forgot to check? Or they are using a template and these lines are automatically filled in or whatever. But anyway, it causes confusion and it could make the offer unenforceable. So make sure that you are clear about that. The first box is the seller's contribution. That's what we normally use as closing cost credits. And you can put the amount in there, check with the lender of the buyer to see what the maximum amount they could use in closing cost credit. But it's also a very important thing now with our new normal, which is the concessions. If the seller is offering concessions, that's when you can check that seller contribution part. You don't put in what the concessions are, or how much the concessions are. You just say that there are concessions available. Is that right, Steph, that that's the best place to put concessions?
On the addendum A, yes. But well, in the MLS, what Joan was just saying in terms of not identifying what the concessions are, that's like from the MLS's perspective. But when it comes to writing the offer, we will need to identify
What they
what they are, yes.
right.
And how much they're gonna ask for. But back to Joan's point, it's still a conversation with the lender. You know, a seller might be offering a concession of, you know, X amount, but it might be the case that the buyer can't use that entire amount. So we just want you to hear that it's just not as cut and dry as it might seem. So just always have conversations with your lender. But I'd also like to comment here too that, like, yes, this idea of concessions has been, you know, kind of more at the forefront since the new normal in terms of just kind of being able to use this word to kind of really to like convey that really like a seller is open to offering the commission. So I'd say like this probably isn't as being used as much as we like thought it was going to be. I feel like most of this is really just being addressed in those offer to purchase lines, as seller paying commission for the buyer.
Right.
So yeah, so I don't think in practice this has really come up as much as we thought it was going to, which is, I think,
You know,
good in a way. Yeah. So,
yeah.
okay.
If you are, if the seller is offering a home warranty, and it should be somewhere in MLS that the home warranty is included. You can put it in your offer, you can put it in addendum A, under this next box, line 10. The idea is if they're not offering it, you can ask for it and see if they will include it. Some properties, whether they are in a condominium or not, have an association fee. Some properties in a subdivision sometimes have an association fee. So if there is any, that's an important place for it. So then the next box is inspections, tests, appraisals, and opinions. Now, this is very important paragraph, and make sure that your buyer, when you're writing up this offer and addendum A, are clear about the use of inspections, it clarifies that the two sections are different. The request for an inspection is in the offer to purchase. The request for testings other than, what is it? Well, anyway, the request for testings is in this addendum A. If you're talking about appraisals, this is something that they're talking about whether they are ready for people to see. And then there's a caution there, the firm and its agents recommends buyer have the property tested and inspections for all conditions that the buyer considers material to the transaction. So that caution line is important because the next box is, are you going to have a testing contingency or not? And I'm very particular when I review contracts that the actual test that they're going to be requesting or list of tests that they're going to be requesting be identified on lines 26 and 27. And they give you some samples, asbestos, mold. There are only so many things that can be tested. And that you realize a test is taking a sample from something, taking it to a lab and having it analyzed. That is a test. Everything else is an inspection. And the two don't cross over. Any questions about testing versus inspection at this point? If you want tests, you have to use the addendum A. You can't say in your offer to purchase any tests being done by the inspection or requested test done by the inspector. You got to keep those separate and ask for the testing here in addendum A and not make it a hanger-oner of the inspection provision in the offer to purchase. Did I confuse you with that?
And as a reminder with that too, the offer to purchase language on inspections, like the entire first section in that provision is
Right.
differentiating between the two, between an inspection and a test. And there's probably about 5 points just within that first paragraph to come
Right.
to.
The bottom line is don't link them together. They are
Right.
two separate provisions in your offer to purchase. And
Right.
so under testing contingency, you want to test the exact name of the test that they want done. Maybe it's asbestos, maybe it's mold, Lead paint is separate on the addendum S, so you're not putting that in here.
I
And
feel like the other big one is air quality. That's the only other one that I've really come across in terms of having a buyer want to test for that.
right, that's a good one.
Yeah.
And then the next
So I
section,
actually thought of one.
go ahead.
So because you have an inspection contingency, that's just inspecting, would the radon be a test?
That is, and that's a separate contingency in the offer to purchase.
It's a test, but it's
Right, and
the only test in the offer to purchase.
right, and what if they want to test for radon during the inspection period, but you know, they're not going to make the offer contingent on the radon numbers. They just want it for their own knowledge, I
Right.
guess.
They can write that up in special provisions, just saying the buyer requests permission to test for radon, but for information purposes only.
Okay,
It's not a contingency, it's a provision.
gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So the next sections are about water, well water. If you are writing in the city, obviously this can be ignored because you don't have well. Some city properties have old wells on them. And that's under the section line 47 under abandoned wells. But addressing existing in-use wells, you want to have the water tested and you want the system tested. This well system testing is testing the pump and seeing how viable the actual pump is. And the depth of the motor and things like that, the height of the well head. The water testing is just that. It's just to get the basics of bacteria, nitrate, and you can add different in additional ones such as lead, pesticides. That's on a line with the examples there. If you want more water tests done, but basically it's just bacteria, nitrate, and arsenic. Make sure that you understand how long these tests take to get the answer for especially arsenic. And you can write that into the timeline of this testing, water testing contingency. You don't want to have it run out and you still haven't gotten the results of your test back. As I said, the next one is, if the well is inspected, the well water testing contingency is automatically selected and included in this offer. So if you're testing the well system, you're automatically testing the water. The water, when they're talking about right to cure, the water testing, you almost always give that right to cure to the seller because it's very easy. Sometimes it's just putting a dose of chlorine in the well and then retesting it to see if it got rid of the bacteria. The well system contingency, you probably want the seller to be responsible for getting that repaired. And sometimes that might include a new well pump, or it may include digging deeper. But it's very important because those are expenses that you may not want to incur after you move into the property. But they're very important if you are using a well. I have a well on our property and as most of Mequon does. And we just get it tested on a regular basis, like every 2 years or so, the water tested. And it's basically good tasting water. Some cases, especially in Bayside, I don't know of other places, some places rural have a shared well agreement. That means they've got one well for 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 houses. There's a special agreement on that to see if there is anything in writing talking about the agreement that the owners have on the operation, maintenance, and use of the shared well, no later than 15 days prior to closing. So you have to have something in writing which does provide them with information of what they're going to get into when they live with this shared well. Then the next part in the addendum A is under sanitary system. It's called POUTS, private on-site wastewater treatment system. And this is an inspection contingency. If you are in an area where there are individual private sanitary systems for the property that your buyer is buying, you want to make sure that this is included. Just a little bit of history. In a lot of the rural areas in Washington County and Ozaukee County and Waukesha County, they had wells that were dug when the property was built. And sometimes that was 1920, 1930, 1950. And they were dug with just a simple septic system, which is a hole in the ground and chemicals put in there. Since then, a lot of the soil around these septic systems has changed and failed to support a septic system. That's the easiest system to have for wastewater, but again, if tested today, the soils usually don't stand up to the standards that we have today. So if a house that you are considering, your buyer's considering, has a septic system from way back, you have to get it tested. It will most likely come back that you have to have an upgraded septic system with upgraded wastewater system, which is either a holding tank, a mound system, or something similar to that. And those require a little more expense. They require a little more maintenance, but be prepared for it, because most septic systems, when they're tested in today's world, don't get accepted. Any questions on POUTS? And if you're cool, you'll refer to it as POUTS.
Could you go over a little more? I'm in the process of hopefully getting an accepted offer, but we wrote in contingencies for the well and water, but I was kind of confused reading through on like the time frame for the deadlines and things, because then it says, you know, it's like 60 days if left unmarked. Like, how long is the turnaround? Is that, and it says prior to closing, so is that 15 days, you know, before closing, and what's the best way to go about all that?
Well, the intent is they want the freshest test of water that you have. So they
Right.
don't want something that you pulled out, you know, last winter or something. So it's got to be no earlier than 60 days prior to the date set for closing. For
So like
both.
if 30 days ago they had their septic pumped, you know, whether it's a tank or, you know, how do you also know? I guess you could probably ask the listing agent to find out what kind of septic system it is, but what if he doesn't know, or what if I guess the owner should know, right?
Yeah, I mean, if they did it 30 days ago, I'm sure with the cost of that, they would know that they did it.
Right.
It should be information that the listing agent should ask about. And if you are going to list a property in that, make sure that you do know the condition of the well and the septic
Yeah, it
wastewater.
just said septic, so I didn't know.
Yeah, but if you but the idea is they want a fresh current test and not an old one. And again, as I
Right.
said, if the water fails, that's very easy for the seller to cure. It's not bad. If the well system fails, that just means, as I said, it might need a new well pump, or it might need deepening the well.
Sure.
And then if the wastewater system fails, it probably will mean they'll need to either get a holding tank, which is a self-enclosed tank that has to be regularly pumped out. The sewage in it has to be pumped out. And so it's ongoing maintenance. A mound system is just what it says, it's a big mound of dirt behind the house.
Right.
And so the waste is not going down into the ground, it's being stored up in this mound. So, but you're good to point out that those timeframes are different than a regular inspection.
Thank you.
Okay. And then it talks about, on the second page, the right to cure regarding contingencies on lines 25, 31, 40, and 55. And it talks about that because there is an importance in whether you give the seller the right to cure on these systems or not. Because of the uncertainty of what these tests might result in, it's probably good to give the seller the right to cure on them so that you can, and if the seller signs, he understands he has the right to cure, and he has a choice of not curing or curing it, or you can negotiate the differences. But that's an important thing to read on lines 65 through 75 about the right to cure. And then it talks about the sanitary district sewer construction. Buyers informed that the property may be located within an established sanitary district. Buyer may be subject to taxes, special assessments, and other charges for sewer planning or construction, user fees, and related costs. I think Bayside is still under one of these assessments. Buyer is encouraged to contact officials of the sanitary district to inquire about some costs. And if you're a really good, diligent buyer's agent, that's what you should be doing. So making sure that there are no future assessments for the sanitary sewer. Some places now have, like, some communities now have a municipal sewer, but well systems, so they have private water, but municipal waste. So if you're in a subdivision, what a subdivision has is generally one big well, and that doesn't need to be tested because that's under the supervision of the DNA. And they have to submit tests on, the subdivision has to submit tests to the what did I say, DNA? DNR.
DNR, yeah.
RNA, on a regular monthly basis or 6-month basis or something like that. So you don't need to add wells in a subdivision because that's handled by a community well. Any other questions regarding waste system or water systems? Okay, next part, it goes on page 2, lines 79 down, are financing issues. And this has all the additional terms that you would need if you're talking about financing. What it describes what the financing commitment contingency means. We used to call it the financing contingency. Now it's called the financing commitment contingency. And it means that your offer is contingent on getting the commitment. And what that means, within 7 days of acceptance, buyer shall obtain written confirmation from a financial institution that buyer has applied for financing. This is important. We've had some buyers who are kind of unsure, kind of dragging their feet, you know, throwing an offer in, and you realize that after a couple of weeks, they haven't even applied for financing. There's lack of intent there and kind of a red flag warning. So make sure that you understand what the financing commitment contingency terms are on lines 80 through 90. If you want to waive the financing commitment contingency and making this a cash offer within usually 7 days, the delivery of a notice of the waiver of the financing contingency. So you send them a notice waiving the contingency, and then buyer delivers written verification from a financial institution or a third party in control of buyer's funds that buyer has at the time of verification, which is at now, sufficient funds to close this transaction, which are not contingent on the sale of the buyer's property. This is important. And when it says at the time of verification, that means now when you're writing the offer, those funds are available, not in 60 days or whatever. Seller agrees to waive seller's rights under the financing commitment contingency if he gets the proof of funds. Delivery of a loan commitment is considered written verification or of sufficient funds to close if the loan contingent is not contingent on the sale of the buyer's property, and buyer provides written verification confirming sufficient funds for the amount by which the sales price exceeds the amount of the loan commitment. So they have to show the extra money they have if beyond the proceeds of the sale of the house. It just means if the seller is going to accept a cash offer, they have to know that the buyer's got the cash. You can put in that section in the offer under proof of funds, you could put in something else. You can say release of, investments no later than a certain date, rather than at the time of verification. If the seller accepts that, the seller trusts the buyer, trusts the buyer's agent that he's really good for it, he's got tons of money. The seller can accept that as not being time of verification proof of funds, but that's only up to the seller if they accept it. The seller may say, nope, I want verification now that you have the funds in a checking account or a savings account or an immediate cash account. Then it talks about FDA, VA, and mortgage. You want to realize that if the parties agree to execute a FHA, VA, that shall give the buyer right to terminate the offer to purchase if it fails to appraise for the purchase price. Seller also agrees to pay the lender at the time of closing a tax service fee not to exceed 100. A lot of times that goes buried, and the agents on either side sometimes are not aware of this. But if, say, something is found in the appraisal of the house, some construction that needs to be fixed or something like that, and the seller refuses to do it, it's not under the inspection contingency, it's under the financing contingency. So you have to realize that if it's something tied to the VA loan or the FHA loan and the appraisal doesn't appraise, that the buyer won't get their money. So it can't be just thinking of it as a defect and the seller doesn't want to fix that defect. If you're getting a VA mortgage, for some reason, you still have to get a termite inspection. Then there's a section there under area conditions, a section under property conditions. Those are important to relay to your buyer when you as a buyer's agent are drafting this addendum A. It's there are hidden things in there that may come up during the time period between the accepted offer and the closing date that the buyer should be aware of. And that's why this addendum A is considered a buyer protection form, really. It's waking the buyer up and saying, make sure you look at this, make sure you look at this. Check the municipality, check this. And as a good buyer's agent, that's part of your responsibility as well. And then page 3 of the addendum A, it talks about underground storage tanks and basement fuel tanks. If seller has notice or knowledge of an underground storage tank or basement above ground fuel tank on the property, or if one is discovered prior to closing, delivered to buyer written confirmation that the tank related components and procedures relating to the upgrading and or closure are in full compliance federal, state, and local regulations. If you're in this situation, get a oil tank contractor. I still like Earl at A1 Tank.
Yeah, classic.
The classic. He tells it like it is, and he really gives a lot of good information when he's doing it. But make sure that you are aware of that. Sometimes the tank is under the driveway, sometimes, it makes it expensive to close it or to remove it. So prepare yourself for the knowledge of the existence of, so that you can be prepared to negotiate. Other building, buyer protections in this, the zoning and building restrictions, comprehensive plans, non-conforming property and building permits. You and as the buyer's agent and the buyer need to understand this. Get to the municipality. Look to see if there's the property you're looking at is non-conforming, which means if it burns down or part of it is destroyed, it can't be rebuilt where it is. That's an important thing to know. And not to assume that everything's okay. So a good investigator is a good buyer's agent, and you have a cooperative buyer to help you look into these things. But it says, and we had a lawsuit settled on this very line, 149 to 150. Buyer assumes all responsibility and liability to research, verify, and confirm any of this information found out. And
Another good way to think of the addendum A is like, it's a buyer protection, but also protects us. Big
it
time.
does, yes. So that this is a very important line when it comes to saying the buyer wants to sue the seller for certain things. And it comes to this line in the contract in buyer addendum A. So if you're not using addendum A, you're not getting this information.
Mhm.
Information on promotional materials, it just says that the information in MLS and additional promotional materials is obtained from a number of different sources and has not been independently verified or confirmed by various real estate firms and agents who have been involved in the transaction. If any particular measurement or data element is important or material to the buyer, buyer assumes all responsibility to liability to research, verify, and confirm. Those three words again. It's buyer's responsibility. They can't say, well, this flyer said that, did you look into it? Surveys are not very common unless they're on vacant land, and platted vacant land is the plat is the survey. So just make sure that you understand that. But generally in our real estate residential transactions, a survey is not required. If somebody's going to put a fence up, they alone should get the survey. Under floodplains and wetlands, buyers aware that floodplain and wetland maps referred to in the offer lack detail, are difficult to interpret, and may not be accurate. Buyers encouraged to personally examine such maps. Again, it's the buyer's responsibility, or consult with an appropriate government official to verify. Insurance provisions, make sure that you work with that. Electric service, flood insurance, rental property ordinances. These are all statements that make you aware and the buyer aware of what the responsibilities are. So.
Yeah, a lot of
Yes.
CYA.
Yeah, it is. And it's important to review with your buyer. The last page has any addendums that are attached and the information from the buyer's agent and the listing agent out of MLS.
Mhm.
Any questions, call Steph or call me. We're happy to walk through this on your own particular transactions.
Thanks for hanging in there with us, guys.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
It's a lot, but it's important.
Thank you so much, Joan.
Thanks,
Great.
Steph.